Richard Caldwell stood in the shadows of the parking garage, his gray janitor's uniform hanging loose on his 62-year-old frame. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the concrete floor. From his vantage point, he watched his son, Ethan, 34 and sharp as a razor, lean over the hood of a sleek black Mercedes. Ethan's pen scratched across a stack of papers, his movements quick and deliberate, handing them off to a man in a tailored suit who reeked of cigar smoke and bad intentions. Richard's jaw tightened. He could barely make out the words, but he didn't need to. The way Ethan smirked, the way the stranger nodded too eagerly it was enough. "I can't believe this is the man I raised to take my place," Richard muttered under his breath, his voice lost in the hum of the garage. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Richard Caldwell was the founder of Caldwell Enterprises, a financial empire he'd built from nothing over 4 decades. A titan in the industry, he'd spent his life preaching hard work, integrity, and fairness. But now, at 62, with his silver hair hidden under a cheap cap and his calloused hands gripping a broom, he was playing a different role, an invisible nobody spying on his own company. It wasn't pride that drove him to tease, it was fear. Fear that everything he'd sacrificed for was slipping away. It started 6 months ago. Whispers from the lower ranks reached him, first grumbling about unpaid overtime, hushed complaints about unfair firings. Then came the anonymous lawsuits, piling up like storm clouds. Richard had confronted Ethan, his only son and the company's current CEO, over dinner at the old family house in Connecticut. "What's going on, Ethan?" he'd asked, pouring them both a glass of bourbon. Ethan had just shrugged, his blue eyes glinting with that cocky edge Richard had never liked. "It's under control, Dad. Just noise from the little people. You're retired, let me handle it." But Richard couldn't let it go. His wife, Ellen, had been gone 15 years, taken by cancer, and the company was all he had left. He'd poured his soul into it, hoping Ethan would carry the torch. Now, he wasn't so sure. So he'd done the unthinkable. 2 weeks ago, he'd walked into his own building as Tom Grayson, a new security guard with a fake ID and a story about needing a steady gig after years bouncing between jobs. No one recognized him, not the receptionists, not the middle managers, not even Ethan. The disguise was simple: a slouch, a pair of thick glasses, and a willingness to blend into the background. Richard had always been good at reading people, and he figured a few weeks undercover would tell him what his son wouldn't. He hadn't expected to feel this sick so soon. Tonight, sweeping the garage after hours, he'd stumbled onto something bigger than rumors. Ethan's late-night meeting wasn't on any official schedule. Richard edged closer, broom scraping softly against the concrete, until he could hear snippets of their talk. "The numbers line up," Ethan said, tapping the papers. "We move it offshore, and no one's the wiser." The stranger chuckled, a low, greasy sound. "You're a smart kid, Caldwell. Your old man would have never had the guts for this." Richard's blood ran cold. Offshore accounts? Falsified books? This wasn't just mismanagement, this was betrayal, pure and simple. He retreated to a corner, pretending to empty a trash can, his mind racing. He thought of the early days, back in 1984, when he'd started the company with a $50,000 loan and a desk in his garage. He'd worked 18-hour days, missed Ellen's birthdays, skipped Ethan's Little League games all to build something honest, something lasting. And now his own flesh and blood was tearing it apart. Richard's chest ached, not from age, but from a wound deeper than he'd felt since Ellen's diagnosis. He needed more than suspicions, though. He needed proof. The next morning, he clocked in early, blending into the bustle of the 42nd floor. Employees shuffled past, clutching coffee mugs and avoiding eye contact. The air smelled of toner and tension. Richard lingered near the finance department, sweeping the same spot for too long, when he overheard a hushed conversation. Olivia Carter, a sharp-eyed 29-year-old manager, leaned toward a co-worker at the copier. "There's a hole in the books," she whispered, her voice tight. "Millions unaccounted for. I'm digging into it, but something's off." Her colleague, a nervous guy with a tie too loud for his personality, shook his head. "You're poking a bear, Liv. Ethan's not going to like that." Olivia straightened, her jaw set. "I don't care what Ethan likes. This is wrong. Richard froze, broom still in hand. Olivia Carter. He knew her name, smart, driven, one of the few hires Ethan had bragged about. If she was onto something, it could be the key to unraveling Ethan's mess. But it also meant she was in over her head, maybe even in danger. Richard's mind clicked into gear. He couldn't confront Ethan, yet not without hard evidence. And he couldn't tip his hand to Olivia, not when she didn't know Tom Grayson was anything more than a janitor. He watched her walk back to her desk, her shoulders squared like she was heading into battle. Ethan's office loomed at the end of the hall, its glass walls a mockery of transparency. Richard gripped the broom tighter, a plan forming. He'd spent his life building this company, and he'd be damned if he let it crumble now, not because of greed, not because of his own son. Whatever Ethan was hiding, Richard would find it. He'd shadow him, dig deeper, and get to the truth, no matter what it cost. Because if there was one thing Richard Caldwell knew, it was this: you didn't turn your back on what you'd fought for. Not ever. What was Ethan planning next? Richard didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. Richard Caldwell had never been one for sitting still, but blending into the background as Tom Grayson tested every ounce of his patience. The next few days dragged on, each one a slow burn of frustration as he swept floors and emptied trash cans, all while keeping an eye on Ethan. His son moved through the 42nd floor like a king, his tailored suits crisp and his voice loud enough to carry over the hum of printers. But Richard saw what others didn't, the way Ethan's smile never reached his eyes, the way he barked orders without a shred of warmth. It wasn't leadership. It was control, plain and simple. The first real crack showed up on a Tuesday morning. Richard was mopping the break room when Ethan stormed in, his face red and his tie askew. A young guy from marketing, Tim. Maybe Richard couldn't keep all the names straight, trail behind him, clutching a stack of reports. You call this a projection? Ethan snapped, snatching the papers and tossing them into the trash. You're done. Pack your stuff. Tim stammered something about deadlines, but Ethan cut him off. I don't pay you to make excuses. Out. The kid slunk away, head down, while Ethan poured himself a coffee like nothing had happened. Richard's grip tightened on the mop handle. He'd taught Ethan better than this, sir, so he'd thought. It didn't stop there. By the end of the week, 2 more employees were gone, one for questioning a budget cut, the other for missing a meeting. Whispers spread like wildfire through the cubicles. He's on a warpath, someone muttered near the water cooler. You're next if you don't keep your head down, another replied. Richard felt the air shift. Fear was seeping into the walls of Caldwell Enterprises, a place he'd built to be a beacon of fairness. He couldn't stand it, but he kept his mouth shut. Tom Grayson didn't have opinions. Not yet. Olivia Carter, though, wasn't bending. Richard caught glimpses of her defiance every day. She'd stay late, her desk lamp glowing long after the others clocked out, poring over spreadsheets with a focus that reminded him of himself 30 years ago. He'd linger nearby, pretending to dust a shelf or fix a flickering light, close enough to overhear her muttering about discrepancies and offshore transfers. She was onto something big, and Ethan was starting to notice. One afternoon, Richard saw him pause outside her cubicle, his eyes narrowing as she typed furiously. Everything okay, Olivia? Ethan asked, his tone too smooth to be genuine. She looked up, unflinching. Just doing my job, Ethan. He nodded and walked away, but Richard knew that look. His son was a predator sizing up prey. The real blow came late Friday night. Richard had volunteered for the overnight shift, figuring it'd give him a chance to poke around undisturbed. He was sweeping the executive hallway when he heard voices from Ethan's office. The door was cracked open, just enough for him to slip into the shadows and listen. Inside, Ethan sat across from a man Richard didn't recognize, him mid-50s, slick hair, a gold watch that screamed new money. The books are clean now, Ethan said, sliding a folder across the desk. We've moved $8 million through the Cayman shell. By next quarter, it's 20. The man grinned, flipping through the pages. Beautiful. You're a natural, kid. Old man Caldwell would have had a heart attack over this. Ethan laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Good thing he's out of the picture. Richard's stomach twisted. $8 million. Offshore shells. This wasn't just sloppy management. Ethan was looting the company, bleeding it dry under the guise of profit. And the jab about him being out of the picture, that stung worse than the betrayal itself. He'd handed Ethan the keys to everything, trusted him to carry on the legacy. Now, here was his son, laughing about it with some sleazy investor. Richard wanted to barge in, rip the folder from their hands, and demand answers. But he didn't. He needed more, something concrete he could take to the board, something that'd stick. The next morning, the tension ratcheted up. Olivia had barely settled at her desk when Ethan's assistant marched over, flanked by 2 security guards. "Hand over your laptop," the assistant said, voice clipped. Olivia blinked, her face paling. What? What? Company policy. One of the guards grunted, stepping closer. Suspicion of data breach. It was a lie, and everyone in earshot knew it. Olivia's hands shook as she surrendered the machine, but her eyes burned with defiance. "This isn't over," she said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. Ethan watched from his office, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Richard's heart pounded as he swept the same spot for the 3rd time, blending into the chaos. Olivia's laptop held the proof. She'd been chasing the same proof he needed. If Ethan's team scrubbed it, they'd lose everything. Worse, Olivia was a target now. He'd seen how Ethan handled threats to him from marketing was proof enough. Richard couldn't let her become the next casualty. He didn't know her well, but she was fighting for the same thing he was, the truth. That made her an ally, whether she knew it or not. He ducked into the stairwell, his mind racing. Ethan was moving fast, covering his tracks with every step. Richard had to move faster. He could try to get to Olivia, warn her somehow, but that risked blowing his cover. Or he could dig deeper himself, find a way into Ethan's files before the evidence vanished. Either way, the clock was ticking. He thought of Ellen, how she'd always said family was worth fighting for. But what if the family was the enemy? Hey, if you've ever been stuck choosing between loyalty and what's right, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Richard imagined saying, if he could break character for a moment. And if you're liking the story so far, hit that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. It means a lot. Stick around, because things are about to get messy. He shook off the thought, refocusing. Ethan's next move was coming, and Richard had to be ready. What was his son hiding behind that locked office door? Whatever it was, it wouldn't stay buried for long. Richard Caldwell couldn't sleep that night. The weight of what he'd heard in Ethan's office clung to him like damp fog. $8 million siphoned off, funneled into some shadowy account in the Caymans. His son's voice echoed in his head, that cold laugh cutting deeper than the numbers ever could. Richard lay on the lumpy couch in his small rented apartment, the one he'd taken to keep up the Tom Grayson charade, staring at the ceiling. He'd built Caldwell Enterprises to stand for something: honesty, stability, a legacy he could pass down. Now it was a house of cards, and Ethan was the wind about to knock it over. The next day, he clocked in early, his janitor's uniform feeling heavier than ever. He needed evidence, something solid, not just overheard whispers. Ethan's office was the key, but getting in wasn't simple. The door was always locked, the windows tinted, and Ethan's assistant hovered like a hawk. Richard had one shot, the overnight shift. He noticed the cleaning crew left a supply closet unlocked near the executive suites. If he could slip in after hours, maybe he'd find a way past the security. It was a long shot, but long shots were all he had left. That night, the building was quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC system. Richard waited until the last guard finished his rounds, then grabbed a ring of keys from the closet. Most were for storage rooms, but one looked promising, a small silver thing labeled maintenance override. He crept down the hall, heart thudding, and slid the key into Ethan's door. It clicked. He was in. The office smelled of leather and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the stale coffee of the break room. Richard didn't waste time. He powered up Ethan's desktop, praying the password hadn't changed since he'd last peeked over his son's shoulder years ago. Ellen, 84. It worked. The screen lit up, and Richard's hands trembled as he opened the files. At first, it was standard stuff: quarterly reports, client emails. Then he found it, a folder buried deep, labeled Cayman projections. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, and a scanned contract. The numbers hit him like a punched $20 million slated to vanish by next quarter, funneled through a shell company called Triton Holdings. But that wasn't the worst of it. One email, dated 3 months ago, stopped him cold. It was from Ethan to the slick-haired investor. Once we cash out, the old man's legacy goes bankrupt. No one will trace it back. We're golden. Richard stared at the words, his breath shallow. Ethan wasn't just stealing, was planning to tank the company, to let it collapse and walk away rich while Richard's name took the fall. The room spun. Richard gripped the desk, fighting the urge to smash the monitor. This wasn't mismanagement or greed gone wild. This was calculated, personal. Ethan wanted to erase everything Richard had built, to bury it under a pile of lies and leave him with nothing. He thought of Ellen, how she'd believed in Ethan even when he'd started acting out as a teen. He'll grow into himself, she'd said, smiling through her chemo fog. Richard had clung to that hope, poured it into raising their son, trusting him with the company after her death. Now that trust was a knife in his back. He printed the email and a few key spreadsheets, tucking them into his uniform. He had proof now, but it came with a price. If he took this to the board, Ethan would be finished arrested, maybe, or at least stripped of everything. The scandal would hit the papers, drag the Caldwell name through the mud. His son, his only family, would be gone for good. But if he stayed silent, the company would crater anyway, taking thousands of jobs with it, people like Olivia, Tim, all the ones Ethan had trampled. Richard shut down the computer, his mind a storm of guilt and fury. He'd spent his life choosing family over everything else. Could he stop now? The answer came the next morning, sharp and uninvited. He was sweeping the finance floor when Olivia cornered him near the copier. "Tom, right?" she said, her voice low but urgent. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the floor. "You're around a lot. See anything weird?" Richard hesitated. Did she suspect him? "Just trash and coffee spills," he muttered. She studied him, then leaned closer. "I found something before they took my laptop. Itanes idam medio. I think he knows I know." Her hands fidgeted, but her gaze was steady. "If I don't do something, no one will." Richard's throat tightened. She didn't know who he was, didn't know he'd already seen the truth. But her words lit a fire he couldn't ignore. Olivia was risking everything, her job, maybe Moretto fight for what was right. He couldn't let her stand alone. He thought of the papers in his locker, the proof that could end this. Ethan's betrayal wasn't just against him, it was against everyone who trusted Caldwell Enterprises. Family or not, Richard couldn't protect a lie. He straightened, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Be careful," he said, his voice rougher than he meant. "You're not wrong about him." Olivia nodded, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, then hurried back to her desk. Richard watched her go, a decision settling into his bones. He'd confront Ethan not as Tom, but as himself. No more hiding. He'd built this company with his own hands, and he'd tear it down himself if it meant saving what mattered. The showdown was coming. Ethan wouldn't see it until it was too late. Richard Caldwell spent the next day in a haze, the printed email and spreadsheets burning a hole in his locker. Every time he swept past Ethan's office, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down harder. Confronting his son wasn't just a risk, it was a detonation, one that'd blow up everything he'd held dear. But the alternative was worse. Letting Ethan gut the company and walk away wasn't an option, not after 40 years of sweat, not after Ellen's faith in their family. Richard had made up his mind. He'd face Ethan, lay the truth bare, and let the chips fall. He chose Friday afternoon, a time when the office buzzed with end-of-week chaos. Ethan wouldn't expect it, not in broad daylight, not with witnesses. Richard waited until his son stepped out for a meeting, then slipped into the executive conference room. He'd arranged it through Michael Dawson, his old friend and the company's longest-serving advisor. Michael was the only one who knew the truth about Tom Grayson, and he'd agreed to keep it quiet until Richard was ready. "You sure about this?" Michael had asked over the phone, his gravelly voice thick with worry. "Once you pull this trigger, there's no going back." Richard had just grunted, "I'm sure." At 3 o'clock sharp, Ethan strode in, his usual swagger faltering when he saw Richard standing there, not in the janitor's uniform, but in a suit, the same kind of crisp navy he'd worn as CEO. The papers sat on the table, a silent accusation. Ethan froze, his eyes darting from Richard to Michael, who leaned against the wall with a grim expression. "What's this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Richard didn't flinch. "Sit down, Ethan. We need to talk." The room felt smaller as Richard slid the email across the table. Ethan's face drained of color as he read it, but he recovered fast, tossing it back with a sneer. "What's this supposed to prove?" Digging through my trash now." Richard leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "It proves you're stealing from the company I built. 8 million already gone, 20 more on the way. And you're planning to let it all crash me name, my work, everything." Ethan's jaw twitched, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he went on the attack. "You think you can waltz back in here and play hero? If you take this public, the company's done. You'll lose it all 40 years down the drain. You really want that?" Richard's chest ached. Ethan wasn't wrong. The scandal would tank the stock, scare off clients, maybe even shutter the doors for good. But then he saw Ellen's face and his mind, her quiet strength, her belief in doing right no matter the cost. "I'd rather lose at standing up than watch you burn it down, sitting on my hands," he said. Ethan laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You're pathetic. Always were. Mom's gone, and you're still clinging to her fairy tales about honor. This is business, Dad. Grow up." That was the twist the knife Richard hadn't seen coming. Ethan didn't just want the money. He wanted to erase the past, to rewrite the Caldwell name as his own. It wasn't greed driving him, it was resentment, festering all these years. Richard's hands clenched into fists. He'd given Ethan everything: love, trust, the keys to an empire, and this was how his son repaid him. For a moment, he wavered. Maybe he could talk Ethan down, salvage something, keep this in the family. But the moment shattered an hour later. Richard was back in his janitor's gear, sweeping the lobby to clear his head, when he saw Olivia Carter storm out of the elevator, her face pale and her arms full of a cardboard box. Ethan had fired her right there, in front of the whole finance team, claiming insubordination. Richard caught her eye as she passed, and she stopped, her voice shaking. "He's burying it all. I try to fight, but he's too fast." She didn't wait for a reply, just kept walking, the glass doors swinging shut behind her. That was a point of no return. Seeing Olivia, a woman half his age with twice his guts, tossed out like garbage, snapped something in Richard. He'd almost let Ethan's words sway him, almost chosen blood over justice. Not anymore. He marched to his locker, grabbed the papers, and called Michael. "Set up an emergency board meeting," he said, his voice hard as steel. "Tomorrow. Full attendance. I'm ending this." Michael didn't argue. "I'll handle it. Watch your back, Rich." Richard spent the night plotting. The board could oust Ethan with a majority vote, but it'd take every ounce of his credibility to pull it off. He'd have to reveal everything: his undercover stint, the files, Ethan's plan to bankrupt the company. It'd be a circus, and Ethan would fight dirty. Richard knew his son wouldn't go quietly twist the truth, rally allies, maybe even turn the board against him. But Richard had one card left: the truth, raw and unfiltered. He'd built Caldwell Enterprises on it, and he'd use it to take Ethan down. The dark settled in, heavy and thick. Richard sat alone, the papers spread out on his kitchen table, each line awound. He'd lost Ellen years ago, and now he was losing Ethan not to death, but to something uglier. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that meeting and face his son, not as a father, but as a man defending what he'd spent a lifetime building. The fight was coming, and it'd be brutal. What would Ethan throw at him when the masks were off? Richard didn't know, but he'd be ready. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a fitting stage for the reckoning Richard Caldwell had spent 40 years building toward. It was Saturday morning, the emergency meeting packed with every board member Michael could wrangle 10 suits around a long table, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Richard stood at the head, no janitor's uniform now, just his old Navy suit and a stack of damning papers. Ethan sat across from him, arms crossed, his smirk barely hiding the tension in his jaw. The air crackled. This was it. Richard didn't waste time. "I've been undercover in my own company for weeks," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Gasps rippled through the room. He laid it out posing as Tom Grayson, the overheard deals, the files he'd pulled from Ethan's computer. Then he slid the email across the table, the one where Ethan bragged about bankrupting the legacy. $8 million already gone, Richard said. 20 more planned. My son's been bleeding us dry, and he wants the whole thing to collapse. The board erupted, voices overlapping in shock and anger. Ethan shot to his feet. This is insane. He's lost its retirements, made him paranoid. But Richard was ready. He'd spent the night rehearsing, steeling himself for this. He met Ethan's glare and saw the boy he'd raised smart, stubborn, now twisted by something Richard couldn't name. "Sit down, Ethan," he said, quieter now. "You're done lying." The room hushed as Richard nodded to Michael, who pulled out a laptop and played a recording Olivia's voice, crisp and clear, from a hidden file she'd emailed Michael late last night. Ethan's voice followed. "Once we cash out, no one will care what's left. Screw the old man's dream." The board's faces hardened. Ethan's smirk vanished. That was the micro-twist Richard hadn't expected. Olivia hadn't just walked away after her firing. She fought back, sent the audio to Michael as a last stand. It was the nail in Ethan's coffin. Richard watched his son slump back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. The board didn't hesitate. A vote was called 8-2. Ethan was out. Richard would step in as interim CEO until they could stabilize things. Security escorted Ethan from the room. His parting shot a hissed, "You'll regret this, Dad." Richard didn't reply. He'd already lost enough. The aftermath settled in slow and heavy. By Monday, the news broke. Ethan faced an investigation, the FBI digging into Triton Holdings and the offshore accounts. Caldwell Enterprises teetered, stock plunging, but Richard moved fast. He rehired Olivia as head of finance, tasking her with untangling the mess. "You've got grit," he told her in his office, the first time he'd spoken to her as himself. She smiled faintly. "So do you, Mr. Caldwell." Together, they started clawing back what they could, cutting deals with regulators to keep the doors open. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. Richard sat alone that night, the house quiet without Ellen's laughter or Ethan's chatter. He'd saved the company, but the cost was steep. His son was gone, maybe not forever, but for now a stranger. Richard traced the edge of a photo on the mantle, him and Ellen at the company's first office opening in 1984. He'd done what she'd have wanted, chosen justice over blood, but it didn't fill the hole. He wondered if Ethan would ever see it, if he'd ever understand, or if some betrayals cut too deep to mend. What would you do, he thought, if you had to pick between family and what's right? "Thanks for sticking with this story," he imagined saying, breaking the silence of his empty living room. "It's been a tough one to tell, but I'm grateful you're here. If it hit you anywhere close to how it hit me, drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit that like button if you're moved, and subscribe if you want more. There's plenty of stories left to share, so check out the next video on the channel. It's going to be a wild ride. See you soon." He leaned back, the weight easing just a little. The fight was over, but the echoes lingered. Time would tell what came next.